Well, joining us this week for our weekly discussion of the news are Samah Hadid, who's a former youth representative for the UN, and Michael Photios, the New South Wales Liberal Party Vice President and, of course, former New South Wales Liberal MP. Thank you very much to both of you for coming in this morning. We're going to start off with the Middle East, and there are still many rebellions going on in Syria and Libya. I wonder, Samah Hadid, how should the international community be dealing with this? For example, we've now got Syrians who are trying to get into Turkey. There's already thousands of them. What should we do?
Well, it's turned into a humanitarian crisis as of yet. As an activist, a human rights activist following the brutal killings and the arrests and detentions, I would hope that the Security Council would send a strong condemnation towards the Syrian regime. I wouldn't support military intervention. I recently interviewed the president's cousin, Rabal al-Assad, who is actually leading the pro-democracy movement against the regime in exile. He reinforced to me, as many others have, that a military intervention in Syria will automatically lead to involvement by Iran and Hezbollah. And I think that is far too great a risk for the international community to take. We don't want another Libya as well, which we've seen a stalemate emerge. And the other question is, of course, when it comes to Syria, why are we not considering Yemen and Bahrain as well? Why are we not equally condemning them and considering a military intervention in those particular areas when their regimes have brutally targeted civilians in the same fashion?
Michael Photios, do you agree? Should we steer clear of military intervention?
I don't think we should steer clear of activation, and merely to expect the United Nations, which has failed progressively as the Arab Spring has evolved at a grassroots level, is to abdicate, in my view, our moral responsibility to protect the people from these atrocities. And Samah, I will appreciate military intervention is a hard ask for people in the Middle East. It was difficult for Libya, but whilst you might say it's a stalemate, I think we're starting to see signs that that stalemate is breaking and Gaddafi will be broken. And if that happens, it will be an indication of engagement without troops on the ground. And I think that's the essential differentiation which has made Libya, as opposed to Afghanistan or Iraq, for instance, a swifter success. You've got to give stakeholder ownership to the people, but you've got to support the people in the face of a dictatorial regime whose atrocities cannot and should not be forgiven and excused by inaction.
But we're also seeing Libyan refugees emerging along the borders. We're seeing that it is actually becoming an Afghanistan and Iraq. And at what cost and at what length do we invest in these regions? And what is the exit strategy? Unfortunately,
I'd say, Samah, revolution comes at a price. And if the people need to overthrow dictatorial regimes, it won't always be the wonderfully successful model that Gandhi gave us in India, particularly when you've got families involved in protecting at all costs their power. They've had it for decades and they won't shake loose unless someone gives them a very, very solid push. So in the course of human history, there will be a need to pay the most modest of price we can only hope to actually get the maximum freedom.
But does Samah have a point in that if we go in one area, what about all the other areas? And then I suppose some people could say, what about other rogue regimes?
Now, the inconsistency of the Western application of roles is undeniable. The Western world sees an ally here and goes soft and plays harder where it has a political axe to grind. And I think that's a question the West has to face up to too. The hypocrisy of a different set of cards played to different rules in different parts of the Middle East only brings into question the philosophy I enunciate. So I don't want to excuse the fact that it's not good enough for the world or the US to go soft here and hard there. There's got to be a measure of consistency in this, but the rule of thumb should be, if a government's going to send tanks into villages and murder its citizens, the West can't simply pass resolutions belatedly at forums in luxury hotels somewhere on the other side of the world and expect that we're going to see results. I actually support intervention on a limited basis that demonstrates the world says enough's enough, but it does have to be consistent, and America's message has got to be more consistent.
Well, can I ask you directly too, we've had in the past week Israeli soldiers shooting on unarmed civilians in the Golan Heights. What should be done about that?
Well, I think a very troublesome development in the last few years. It began with human shields some decade or so ago as a way of protecting military operations by throwing and thrusting civilians into the front line, then became suicide bombers, but increasingly younger now, demonstrators and protesters at the front line and for Israel to engage by shooting back at demonstrators is a very dangerous development indeed. Israel should accommodate that in a much more orderly and structured and humane way and not try to draw parallels with demonstrators crossing boundaries as mini invasions. It clearly isn't.
Well, that's where I would agree with you on, because these particular protesters were unarmed and they did not cross any ceasefire border. So for Israel to respond in such a disproportionate way is, I suppose, also a reflection of their paranoia now. They are severely paranoid about what the Arab Spring, what these revolutions and these uprisings will mean for Palestinian refugees who have been inspired and have taken upon themselves to protest their situation.
Okay, well, let's move on. The Productivity Commission's report on where Australia stands in the world on the question of carbon abatement was released on Thursday. Let's hear first from Treasurer Wayne Swan.
This report zeroes in on this very important finding, and that is that the cheapest and most effective way to reduce carbon pollution and to support clean energy is through a price on carbon.
There is no other comparable country which is imposing an economy-wide carbon tax on itself. There's no other comparable country which is imposing an emissions trading scheme on itself. What that means is that any move towards a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme would be an economic own goal. It would be an act of economic self-harm by Australia.
It does answer two substantive questions that I raised probably 6 months ago now. One being, is the rest of the world doing something or is it doing nothing? I think the answer is yes. The rest of the world is moving in a direction. The second one, I think has been obvious to anybody in recent months, is that if you are going to address this issue, a carbon pricing mechanism is the way to address it.
Okay, well, we had three views there, ending with Tony Windsor. Michael Photios, if I can ask you first, do you agree with Tony Abbott that the Productivity Commission's report shows that we're some way out of step?
Well, the Productivity Commission report demonstrates that there are a multitude of solutions being implemented worldwide, and one of the problems, of course, confronting us all the way through to Copenhagen and the failure of Copenhagen to properly address this on a global basis has been the unwillingness of the world to address a global problem with a global solution. Now, that fracturing means the debate here, like around the rest of the world, comes up with different solutions. The report itself, in my view, demonstrates, amongst other things, quite to the credit of Australia, that in GDP terms, we're actually investing far more as a percentage than almost anyone else in the world. In terms of real dollar value, carbon price dollar value equivalence, we're somewhere in the middle of the pack.
So what does it make you feel overall about the carbon tax and the direction that we're heading in?
I think the debate is a political one and it should get more scientific, and the debate as a political one should get more practical, and we should embrace leadership on this question.
Whose leadership?
Both political parties, to their credit, accept that climate change is a reality. But the spin-off from the debate has become very much one about scoring points rather than addressing the whole solution. You've got two approaches, an ETS, a carbon pricing approach, and a direct action package. All three have a measure of relevance to the debate, but I think we've got to be focused on taking a little of the politics out of this climate challenge and actually coming down to real solutions.
So who do you blame for putting the politics into it, just very briefly?
Well, it's a political football, and obviously both political parties are making their point. The coalition, to its credit, commenced under John Howard and Malcolm Turnbull an approach that focused around an ETS. that's been superseded by a new strategy from Tony Abbott, direct action. At least you can say this: all the major political parties agree on one thing: climate change is a reality and humans make their contribution. At least the leadership doesn't fall into the denialist category that so many Australians unfortunately have been swept up in.
Samah, Hadid?
Well, you were saying that all of these options that we have can be quite effective and they're all measurable. I think what the Productivity Commission's report very clearly highlighted is that a direct action approach isn't actually that effective and it is expensive, whereas a price on carbon is actually the preferable option here. And many countries, many of our competing economies, are actually taking that same path, whether it's through an ETS or not. And I think the price on pollution for us would be the most effective pathway, because it will eventually lead to an ETS and we would be actually going in line with international patterns. So I think this report, thank heavens, could apply a practical and far more measured input in this debate.